At the very highest level of play in League Zero, there has always been one of the most unique subcultures the community has ever played host to. It's not quite as simple as the best players rising to the top, there's more to it. There's this mindset, a personality even, where only those with the strongest wills and the thickest skins can survive an entire season of grueling competition. There's bound to be those that litter the bottom of the leaderboards, and those that will climb to the precipice of success and claim their victory as if it were predetermined. It's impossible to say whether we as a community breed an environment where these kinds of teams and players can succeed, or if they just happen to be the most skilled challengers to take on the trials before them. Regardless, it's hard to say that in storylines like this latest season's, that there isn't a certain mysticism surrounding it, as if the stars themselves aligned to ensure some long-forgotten prophecy would come true, and this very specific group of players would take up the mantle of champions after chasing that dream for so very long. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, because before there can ever be a championship to be claimed, there must first be a journey. Advanced Season 2 is a tale of hardships, inner struggles, collapses, and ultimately, triumphs. Let's take a ride through the annals of history and see how a scrappy young group of tryhards managed to claim it all at the end of the day. Season 2, Season in Review, Advanced Division. As per usual by this point in the league's history, the upper divisions tend to have the largest veteran presence, and that rang true for Season 2's Advanced Division as well. Every single manager chosen at the start had some level of experience with the community in the past, whether that was previous management experience, working as team staff, or even just as a player up until that point. As you could expect, the strategy for every team going into the draft was very different depending on who was in charge and where they came from originally. Longtime community veteran and first-time manager Recto took up the mantle of manager of Hangzhou Bark, immediately using up all 4 of his protects in the draft for previous members of the team such as Agreed, Jepik, YOLOGod, and Chuggy J. It was a bold strategy for sure, as that left them with little action to take until nearly halfway through the draft, but at the same time it gave them 2/3 of a starting roster with a large amount of pre-established synergy right off the bat. Of course, crucial pieces to the team's success in Season 1 such as Andrew and Hedwig weren't picked up, but that didn't mean they couldn't salvage together a strong enough roster to make up for those missing alumni. For the most part, they stuck to their immediate friend group, with a few exceptions like the promising DPS Kaigo, even though he was suspended for the first few games of the season due to some unfortunate choice of words in general chat. Regardless, Hangzhou Bark wasn't looking too shabby coming out of the draft, all things considered. So long as they could keep their heads in the game, most expected them to be alright. Hanamura Hotshots was almost the exact opposite from Hangzhou, however, as their manager Hamop had basically no experience with the Advanced Division player base. He had just come off of coaching Botburgers during their incredible Season 1 run, and had made quite a name for himself among the now intermediate crowd. His lack of knowledge didn't bode too well for his ability to draft in a division where almost everyone worked off of connections, but at the same time Hamop made some incredible mid-season pickups for Botburgers in the past, so he definitely could scout talent when needed. He ended up drafting a mixed roster of very highly rated players such as Client or Jishua, but then also some incredibly low-ranked players like Silverstar or Astra. They ended up having the absolute lowest average SR in their division after the draft, though analysts still saw potential in Hamop's leadership and rated the team rather highly for their preseason power rankings. Goats Only, led by the seasoned veteran Pooter Scooter, self-admittedly didn't do very much scouting for the draft. Their initial plan was to pick up the main tank Brody, as he was the highest peak player that signed up for the entire draft pool. Unfortunately, in the very round before Goats Only could grab their supposed anchor to build around, Brody was sniped by Guangzhou. Pooter went on record in management chat to shout Brody was the plan. While it definitely was funny at the time, it had many people worried about Goats Only's chances going into the start of the season. They fumbled around quite a bit before settling on picking up a lot of veterans from previous seasons such as Chegg, Adam, and Moby. They were predicted to be the worst team coming out of the draft solely due to their lack of planning. Going back to Pooter's intended first pick, however, Brody, Guangzhou was sitting pretty for their entire draft at the thought of stealing away such a highly rated main tank player. Snowman had done quite a bit of scouting during the preseason and ended up picking many of the Season 1 novice players that climbed their way up to High Masters or even GM. So there was some familiarity within the roster, particularly among the Captain Haptic and the off-tank Pings, who had played together for a long time prior to joining on the Gangsters. There were still some concerns early on about players like Brody and Ada being inactive after the draft, but those fears wouldn't really come to light until afterwards. On paper, Guangzhou looked to have an insane potential, and as long as they could keep the pieces together, they could turn out to be a terrifying team in a few weeks' time. Newt was brought back for the third season in a row, and for the first time D'Artagnan would get his chance to draft for the team. He was the returning manager from the last few weeks of Season 1 after the team exploded just before playoffs could happen back then, and staff was more than willing to give him a chance to actually build a team this time around. He kept EOC as his captain and protected Jazza from Season 1, immediately giving the team 2 insanely talented players to start. From there, they picked up even more all-star level talent like Ultra and Baz and filled out their bench with people like Ben, Stanley, and Sparrowkami. The Newts were looking incredibly stacked and were predicted to be a top 3 team coming out of the gates. The returning Advanced Division champions, Crest, or at least their management, decided to make a slight rebrand to the Flock. They wouldn't keep too many of their original championship roster, however, as most of them wanted to go back into the draft pool to see where they'd end up. That meant that only Chance and Milton would be protected to carry on their work from Season 1. Hawk took on the job of managing for Season 2, while Ozzy swapped positions with him compared to Season 1, opting to coach and assist Hawk instead. Most of the players the Flock drafted were a bit lower in the SR bracket for Advanced, but many of them also had a ton of previous synergy with each other from other communities like Tournament of Kings Row. Fortle, Surf, and EMP all had played with each other before, and considering that Chance was focusing more on school at the time, that allowed EMP to start and have a full half-starting roster that had extremely strong synergy right from the start. Analysts were concerned with the team's inability to play double shield very well, but as soon as the meta shifted to Brawl, the Flock suddenly looked like they could be a top half team if they put in the extra practice. Overall, they were predicted to be middle of the pack. Flush, led by former staff and Season 1 finalist Redex and Zero respectively, went for essentially a rebuild of the Chengdu Chads roster from Season 1 with a few extra pieces thrown into the mix. It's safe to say that they went for exclusively their own friend group, which didn't exactly work out too well on the Chads back in the day, so there was definitely some concerns running around people's heads. The skill level of their drafted roster was never in question, but it was up in the air as to whether or not Flush could avoid the mid-season drama collapse that Chengdu suffered before them. With that being said, however, no one could deny the team's potential and place them at a tentative second place spot for the preseason power rankings. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, this season's attempt to rebuild New York locals in League 0, Easy Clap. There really wasn't any better place to attempt this for the umpteenth time than on the most cursed brand in the community's history. Pixelstorm was given the reins of Easy Clap after his heroic attempt to salvage it in the last few weeks of Season 1, and he had chosen longtime veteran Bun as his captain. Of course, Bun was part of the old NYL crew, so there was no doubt what they'd be trying to do come draft time. Players like Yusuf, Gagbag, Swaggy Turtle, and Cybersnip would all attempt to flock to the new version of Easy Clap in an attempt to make a pre-made team in a draft league for reasons. But of course, nothing is ever quite as simple as it should be with the New York locals, and this is the part you've probably been wanting to hear. Aside from Gagbag being swiped up by Flushed in the draft and Easy Clap substituting him with Falcon, Pixelstorm and Bun did manage to pick up just about everyone they wanted. Swaggy Turtle and Cybersnip had unfortunately withdrawn their applications from the draft pool to focus on other things like School or Open Division, and of course Reality was still banned for the time being for being a little prick back in Season 1. That didn't stop him from trying, however, as he did join on an alt called Again, but he wasn't smart enough to try and hide his identity, and he was found out in the first set of pugs he attended during the preseason. Staff received at least half a dozen reports of this and took the account out of the draft pool, eventually removing Reality from the server entirely. Easy peasy, right? Oh, how I wish it was that simple. Easy Clap had drafted a team that turned out to have the highest average SR in all of Advanced by a country mile. Just about every single one of their players averaged around 4.3 to 4.4k, that is all except for 2 random mid to high Masters players who were complete question marks for who they were and where they came from. As it would so happen, these players were brought into question, and after some rather intense investigation, it was discovered that these accounts were more than likely Swaggy and Cyber joining the draft on lower accounts so that they weren't sniped in the same way that Gagbag was by Flushed. This was, of course, the second time Pixelstorm and Bun had attempted to rig the draft in their favor, the first being Reality's alt, and as a result, both players as well as Easy Clap's captain and manager were banned. This left a giant void in the team, with no one sure of who would be able or willing to fill to lead this fractured group of players. Thankfully, Koodle accepted the job of manager with Wannabe as his captain, and Colby took on the role of assistant manager. And to be entirely honest, Colby did most of the managing for Easy Clap at the end of the day. Staff weren't exactly happy with having to completely ban a whole team's management like that, but at the very least they had salvaged the situation enough to make it so that there wouldn't be an empty void where Team once was. And just think, we haven't gotten to the part where any games are played yet.
Despite their immense level of talent and their overall first seed predictions from the power rankings, EasyClap decided to take it easy and focused more on having fun than competing in any serious manner. They refused to scrim and basically just showed up to games, stomped everyone, and memed whenever possible. They would BM occasionally, but it generally never got to the point where it was mean-spirited. As long as they were still willing to compete, that's all that anyone cared about by that point. Hangzhou went through some struggles of their own, with not being able to play their intended roster, though because their players were suspended, not banned. Kaigo had received a 2-game suspension early on in the preseason, and Agreed managed to rack up 1 full game and 3 maps worth of suspensions as well. They did have Juice as a backup main tank, however he was a bit out of his league when you take into account the competition he was facing. They did actually manage to take their second game of the season to a map 4, meaning Agreed got some playtime earlier than he otherwise might have. They still lost their first 2 matches all the same. Ironically enough, both Guangzhou and Goats Only struggled with their main tank position, as Brody was extremely inactive and so was Norse Dude for Goats Only. Both teams were forced to run one of their off tanks on Reinhardt for the first few weeks, depending on whether their starter decided to show up, but it didn't really matter if they did or not. Guangzhou got a free win off Newt not being able to field enough players for week 2, but otherwise struggled all the same. Newt also had some early roster troubles, with Baz and Ultra wanting to be traded away to Flushed so that they could be with their friends. After forfeiting to Guangzhou and then losing an incredibly rough match against the Flock in week 3, they were basically set in their mindset, and a trade was agreed upon between the two. 1 for 1, Megagust for Ultra on main tank and Mythology for Baz on main support. A little silly when you think about it, but they really wanted to play with their friends when all is said and done. Ironically enough, Flushed was going through a rough spell of their own, right around the same time, having tragically lost their game against EasyClap, mostly due to Melon hard throwing the entire time. When everyone else in the lobby is trying, it's practically impossible to win a 5v6, especially in May McCree Brawl when it's your McCree that was throwing. Flushed may have gotten their intended roster, but that didn't help them in the match against Newt, immediately following the trade. A bit of awkward revenge for Megagust and Mythology for sure, and the start of Newt began to stabilize as one of the upper place teams for the rest of the season.
Melon and Gagbag would eventually leave Flushed in favor of riding the bench on EasyClap, and they wouldn't really see any more playtime for the remainder of the season. Somewhat tragic considering the talent they had, but at the same time their heads just weren't in it, so they wouldn't have really played to their full potential anyways. In the meantime, EasyClap continued to claim win after win and remain undefeated for the entire first half of the season, not to anyone's surprise, as really the only team expected to put up a fight against them were Flushed, Newt, and maybe the Flock if they put in a ton of work. The Flock remained undefeated as well leading up to their match with EasyClap, and while they did manage to drag it out to a map 5, EasyClap had the better composure when it mattered most and continued their own streak of dominance. The Flock would also lose out to Flushed for the time being, however they still would easily defeat lower teams in the rankings, so their composure was never really out the window. They only struggled with the top few teams in the leaderboard. Hanamura struggled to get their feet off the ground, and while they were predicted to slowly improve over the course of the season, they never could break past the gatekeepers in the middle of the rankings. They would consistently lose winnable games to teams like Guangzhou and Goats Only to return and upset teams like Newt depending on how much they were feeling it at the time. Much of the earlier upsets in the season was caused by their roster shifting around a lot. Losing Client and Swift in particular hurt them for a couple of weeks. Both of the aforementioned players would eventually find themselves on Flushed, though that wouldn't happen until around the mid-season points. The Hotshots did finally manage to stabilize after picking up their coach Pascal as a player, which is a large reason for why they managed to claim a few wins of their own around that time. The only team that had struggled harder than Hanamura was undoubtedly Hangzhou. No matter what they had tried, the old crew just couldn't recapture their glory from Season 1. They just floundered around, only able to beat Guangzhou. Recto eventually stepped down as manager, leaving Jepik to pick up the pieces. Though this didn't truly fix their problems, as the lack of confidence and unwillingness to make changes was in large part due to the Season 1 crew not being sure about how to handle so many losses. While they were the miraculous comeback story of Season 1 advanced, they definitely were falling short of that expectation for Season 2.
Hanamura managed to face Hangzhou Bark right around the time the former was on their hot streak, and the latter was still struggling with their identity. The easy win at the time helped the Hotshots' mentality, as this was a persistent problem that plagued the team throughout the season, if they couldn't perform up to what they considered an acceptable level. On the other side of the bracket, Flushed management and some of their benched players had disagreements with how they handled certain trades and pickups throughout the season, which led them to leave the team in favour of GOATs only. Some of the players from Hangzhou also opted to move to GOATs only, causing that team to become something of a refugee camp for players who just wanted to take it easy for the remainder of the season, away from unnecessary drama. In the meantime, Flush took the opportunity to fill up their empty roster spots with a few players like Plato, while Hangzhou just suffered even more with the loss of their starters like Term and Vermilion. These new pickups didn't really affect GOATs only in the standings, but their mentality improved dramatically according to the team. Hanamura bled more players as the season started to reach its closing point. Most notably, Flawless left in favour of Guangzhou, where he'd stay for a few weeks before moving into a coaching position for Flushed. Not before claiming victory over the Hotshots alongside the Gangsters first. This was noted as a driving point for Hanamura's season, where they began to care less about performing and just wanted to have fun for however much longer they had to play. The Flock struggled for a few weeks with inactive players, specifically in the flex DPS spot, allowing them to bring in some new blood such as Niril to pair back up with his old partner Peter, who had slowly been gaining more starting time as the season progressed. Not much changed in terms of the Flock's performance, as they would still beat the lesser teams, though they did lose their rematch against Newt Newt rather convincingly. However, by then Newt Newt had picked up the finally unsuspended Kaigo from Hangzhou, and were really starting to hit their stride.
Jepik resigned from managing Hangzhou in favor of becoming team staff for Flushed, leaving Juice to rebuild the roster as the third and final manager of the season, and to his credit, HCB never looked stronger in Season 2 than right after Juice took control. While they had no hopes of ever making playoffs by the time they could finally rebuild, Hangzhou was considered an impressively strong mid-table team for the last couple weeks. They managed to stomp Guangzhou even harder than they had the first time, and earned a lot of respect in advance for what they accomplished as essentially a new team. Guangzhou somehow managed to steal yet another forfeit from Newt Newt, this time due to in-game coaching on the side of Newt Newt. This meant that the Gangsters were locked in for the playoffs despite half of their wins coming from Newt Newt forfeiting to them. Hangzhou was safely out of the playoff contention, meaning that it was up to the final match of Hanamura vs. GOATs only to decide who would get in and go on to the postseason. The game was incredibly close, going all the way to map 5, but in the end GOATs only wanted it more and stole away the 6th and final playoff spot. Hanamura ended their season after 10 weeks of games, though they didn't seem too torn up over the fact that they could finally take a break. Easy Clap was continually dominating the competition, like usual, and they only had one game left for the regular season, Flushed. Despite whatever troubles they may have had towards the middle of the season, Flushed was now a different beast entirely, and looked practically unstoppable. Analysts weren't sure about how to predict in this match, though the notable absence of Wannabe from Easy Clap made it just a little bit easier to guess. The infamous young teen had been focusing on top OD, and later on contenders, so Wannabe had decided to put his games in this community on hold. Of course, Cal loved the opportunity to play a little DPS. However, he just wasn't up to the task of dealing with Plato at the end of the day. Flushed claimed their victory in a 5-map series with one tie, and looked utterly dominant going into playoffs.
Due to the way the conferences in advance worked, both Easy Clap and the Flock had been afforded bye weeks directly to the semifinals, with Easy Clap getting to choose who they faced. This meant that Flushed was up against GOATs only, while Newt Newt got their final chance at revenge against Guangzhou. These games went exactly as you're expecting. I don't know what else to tell you. They were stomps. There were no upsets this time. Easy Clap chose to face Newt Newt for their shot at the finals, though by this point Newt Newt was extremely coordinated with their new lineup and rolled through the first place seed with little resistance. On paper, this was an upset, though in reality it was obvious that both Flushed and Newt Newt had surpassed Easy Clap by then, as the latter kept their promise to never practice once throughout the entire season. What very well may have been the last attempt at rebuilding, NYL bowed out of playoffs in 3-0 fashion, though to their credit, they were incredibly good sports about losing to the Newts. The Flock-Flushed game ended much the same way, with Flushed continuing their dominance and the Flock putting up a respectable fight, all things considered. The final stage was set, and these were undoubtedly the two best teams Advance had to offer. If everything had gone down perfectly, it promised to be a battle of the Titans, duking it out to the very end. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what happened, Mythology ghosted Newt leading up to the game as he was burnt out, and while they had Ben ready to go on the sidelines, he obviously wasn't going to be quite up to the level of his counterpart. Nonetheless, the game was still highly salvageable as the lineups were still relatively even when push came to shove, and it would likely come down to whichever team had the better strategies. The lobby was set and the teams were loaded into the game, just in time for Buffalofo to have internet issues for the vast majority of the first map of Lijiang Tower. This completely killed Newt's momentum, and unfortunately, they never truly recovered. They effectively had to soft forfeit the first map of the series, and while there was still technically plenty of time to salvage it, they just couldn't regain the magic they had leading up to the grand finals. Newt would fall 4-0, leaving Flush to claim the crown they had worked so long and hard for. An achievement some of their players have been chasing since Season 0, while some like Ultra and Red X were then receiving their second championship role. While I'm sure they would have liked the chance to have a closer match, it's hard to deny that Flushed came in swinging, and they were the clear favorites according to the analysts going into the finals. We'll never get to know what might have happened if Mythology actually showed up that night, or if Buffalofo's internet didn't die on Lijiang. But what we do know is that Flushed put up one spectacular performance and carved a swath through Advance to get where they stood at the top of the mountain, wearing the crown they worked so tirelessly to get.
Advanced was weird this season, if I'm being honest. Maybe it's just the whole easy clap draft tricking thing that went on, but I felt mostly numb to the entire division. Probably didn't help that there was an extremely clear division between the top 4 teams versus the bottom 4. Like, there was absolutely no chance for upsets to happen by the time we hit playoffs, and that just made me feel apathetic to the outcome. Don't get me wrong, I'm extremely happy with people like Zira and Baz who could finally get a championship under their belt, but it definitely felt predictable. I'm very glad for the changes we're making going into Season 3's Expert Division, and I'm hoping that at the very least it'll level the playing field as much as possible. We can't do anything about teams becoming the best, but we can try to make sure that the matches are a little bit more entertaining than one-sided stomps every time. Especially with so many of the old guard now moving on from our little community, I see a lot of opportunities for new upper echelons to form and for a whole new breed of top-level games to take place. New dynasties to form and new destinies to fulfill. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to see what the future holds.